I chose this book. It's called Ghost Soldiers by Hampton Sides. My hook was, I can't cover you, Nellis warned. If they go for you, I can't shoot. It'll blow the mission. I think that's a pretty sufficient one. And my rhetorical question comes back to something in the very beginning of the book. One of the characters, I forget his name, but he is really struggling with the question of how to surrender and what it means to surrender, because the U.S. troops were never taught surrender. So they don't really know what to do when they surrender at Bataan. So I already told you the author and the title. So it was published in 2001. It's all about the Bataan Death March. The Bataan Death March in the Philippines when the Japanese occupied the Philippines during World War II. And so Bataan was really bad for Americans because they said it was the worst surrender since since the Civil War. And all of the American troops at Bataan had to surrender, because if not, they would have been killed. So then it's about the Bataan Death March, which is comparable to what the Jews had to go through in the Holocaust, and then what they had to go through at Cabanatuan, I think. And then for each chapters, it flip-flops. So one chapter, it's from the POWs in Cabanatuan, and then another chapter is from the Ranger Battalion that's sent to go rescue them. It's a narrative history novel, obviously, and its main purpose is to inform the audience about the atrocities that the Japanese committed. The more known theater is the European theater, so no one really talks about what happened at the Pacific Theater. But, the rape of Nanking, Manchuria, Bataan, all of those things were, incredibly difficult for American casualties. The human rights crimes that the Japanese committed is substantial, and no one really talks about it. But the argument is basically about how the POWs came to conquer that adversity in the POWs, and how the Rangers, because the Rangers couldn't tell even their own military about the mission. They couldn't let any of this come out. So the Rangers and the Rangers only were the ones who knew about the rescue mission, and no one else could know. So it goes into what the POWs had to go through in the camp, and then what the Rangers had to go through, sneaking behind enemy lines. There was one part where they were literally face to face with a tank that they didn't know was there, and they had to sneak through the tall grass to make sure that the tank couldn't see them, because if it did, then the entire mission would have been blown. The audience is definitely an older audience, and an audience that understands the basic kind of involvement of World War II. Some of the vocabulary I found was pretty difficult. I had to look a lot of words up, and the gore is pretty intense. There's a bunch of scenes where I could have gone the rest of my life without reading the words that were together. But it's a really good book. The historical context is World War II. So the exigence, so why this book happened, is because it was published in 2001, and a lot of the Bataan Death March survivors and the survivors of Cabanatuan were passing away during the 1990s. So, I'm sure this guy didn't write the book in 2000 and then publish it in 2001. So some of the rhetorical strategies that he uses is pathos, imagery, and juxtaposition. I've already talked about juxtaposition, where he goes through the soldiers' accounts, and then from the POWs, and then the Rangers' accounts. But he also goes into the Philippine culture of like what was happening at that time in the Philippines, and then the Japanese culture that was trying to like subdue the Filipino culture, and then American culture. In the beginning, it focuses a lot on how Americans and Japanese were so naive about each other's culture that they had a really hard time like even conversing. Like the Americans thought the Japanese were like subhuman, and the Japanese thought that the Americans were like, I'm just gonna shoot you, um, for lack of a better explanation. Um, and then imagery, the gore, the way that he places the reader in the setting is really, really well done. The scene with the tall grass and the tank um, was really, really well done. Um, and then the gore, I'm gonna save you from the gore, but and then pathos. I mean, the the accounts just from the soldiers, that it's almost like emotional detachment, where you basically see zero emotion in these quotes from these soldiers, and it it invokes empathy, and like the emotions that I felt are similar to the emotions that I felt reading a lot of other books that are similar to this. Um, it was obviously moving, because of the pathos. Um, the rhetorical choices that he used definitely enhanced the power that the message the book was able to push out. It was able to show people like The Rape of Nanking is another book, but it's a really hard read because it doesn't skimp out on anything that Japan did in Nanking. Um, and I feel like a lot of people don't know about the Pacific theater as much as they do as the European theater. Um, I think, again, it should be discussed far more than it is. I think this book gave me a lot of insight about how little Japan is talked about as a um, human rights violation. Um, and then I found an article from the National Museum that talks about the Death March. And then there's a poem in the book. We're battling the bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. No aunts, no uncles, no nephews, no nieces. No pills, no planes, no artillery pieces. And nobody gives a damn. That's in like the very beginning of the book. And then I read another book recently, The Pacific War, 1941 to 1945 by John Costello, which is more around the Pacific War as a whole. I think what will stick with me the most is the fact that the Japanese can go one day and commit so many horrible, horrible things to these people, and then go the next day and be super kind and like give. It's a very strange. It's almost manic, the way that they can switch. Um, I would recommend this to people who are okay with gore and who are comfortable exploring the deeper depths of humanity, because this definitely shows like what people do when they're at their lowest, and what people can do when they're in war. And I think it can be hard for some people to understand like why people do what they do. Um, and this book is it's definitely hard for me to understand why some of the sides of the war did what they did. But it was still amazing book. I would recommend it to anyone who enjoys nonfiction World War II books.